Good evening all, and welcome. In tonight's video we have 10 stories that happened in the middle of nowhere that are sure to leave a shiver down your spine. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, hit that bell for new content every night. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. About 5 years ago, I set out to travel the world. I was a 26-year-old male. Being straight out of college had left me in debt, ever more desperate for any job I was overqualified for, and generally depressed. I felt isolated and alone in my small town in Washington, and found the only way to get out: travel. My high school buddy suggested I look into woofing and volunteered as a way to travel cheap, and so I did. The way it works is quite simple. You work for around 25 hours a week on some farm for food and housing. The draw is that since the community of cheap-ass travelers is quite big, it is a great way to meet new people, get outside your comfort zone, and just let yourself live and figure life out. Fast forward 8 months. I am now a seasoned cowpatch shoveler. I started out in Washington, Oregon, and went to South California from there. I was able to save some money and was paid under the table for some extra work, and was now faced with a decision: where to go in the world. The excitement of being able to purchase a ticket to almost anywhere in the world got the best of me, and on the advice of my dumbass hippie volunteering partner, I chose at random. I went to the randomizer website and clicked the country button. Georgia. The country of Georgia. To say I didn't know anything about it was an understatement, but the fear of the unknown made it exciting and exotic somehow, and so I did it. I purchased a ticket and started browsing for a farm that could host me. There were a few options, and most were remote and hadn't even an internet connection. I messaged every single one because few ever responded, and got a response from one on top of a mountain. The pictures showed a traditional Georgian stone house with a large garden out back, a family with several cheerful children, grandparents having dinner, animals, and it seemed warm and inviting. The description was written in good English, and the requirements for work seemed reasonable. I was excited. After I flew into Tbilisi, the capital, I followed the directions that they had sent me to locate the farm, which wasn't an easy task. Few in Georgia speak English. The roads are messed up and have been for a while, and not been maintained since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the country is generally poor. It took me around 20 hours of Soviet buses and taxis, weird serpentine roads and paths to get to that desired blue pin on my map. It was a dirt path leading up a steep hill into a national park up in the north of the country. There was nothing for miles on end but trees and silence, and as I got up the hill, I saw the house about a half-mile away on an even steeper hill surrounded by the trees. From that viewpoint it seemed abandoned, overgrown, brown and dreary. I walked past the gate. Giri, the apparent owner, approached me. He was a heavy, small, middle-aged guy with a big smile on his face. He shook my hand and in broken English began to show me around. He also smelled of booze. As he was showing me around, I noticed that there wasn't anyone around there but us. I asked about his wife and kids, and he brushed that aside and said something to the extent, "They're away right now." By this point, I'm creeped out. From browsing around, it was apparent that the farm was in deep decline. Apple trees and crops were dying. The roof of the small barn caved in, the house itself full of trash and smelling of mold. It was obvious that Giri was going through a rough patch. But I wasn't going to turn around and just leave in the middle of nowhere, without a plan and not having slept for the last 36 hours. It was evening, and after feeding me well and trying his best he could to hold the conversation in English, Giri showed me to my room on the second floor, and I went to sleep. I almost immediately blacked out from stress and exhaustion, and would have slept for 10 hours if I wasn't awoken by a strange noise in the middle of the night. It sounded like something metallic and heavy was being dragged across the wooden floor. In that sleepy in-between state, I listened to it for a few minutes, thought nothing of it, and went back to sleep once it had stopped. In the morning, Giri, now sober and grumpy, asked me to repair some of the windows and doors in the house, as he himself planned to go fetch some components in a nearby village. Again, I got this weird feeling creeping down my spine. Something wasn't right. He didn't maintain eye contact and was evasive. There was no cell reception, no internet, and once he left, I checked around the house to get a general idea of the place, and it became apparent the place was hardly ever lived in, like one of those abandoned houses where the broken furniture, newspaper, and old photos on the floor and a shattered mirror were. I took my phone and looked through the saved listing again. The photos didn't match neither the backyard, the garden, or the walls. Giri wasn't in any of them. It was a completely different house. Now by this point I am full-blown panicking. I packed my stuff and started to leave when I see a group of 3 men coming up the first hill. There aren't any other paths I can take, so I go behind the house and rush down this hill into the forest. After some time I stop and listen. I hear them at the house and they're clearly looking for me. Afraid of making any noise, I remain still, hidden behind a bush. I didn't know how long I wait, but they were persistent. At some point I hear them leave, so I count until some large number and proceed back into the house and path. And once I find it's clear, I book the hell out of there. I've never ran so fast. But I'm still in the middle of nowhere, no traffic, no public transport, and I reached a paved road and start walking in the general direction from where I remember coming. Hours go by, and finally a car drives by and stops. Now, in the horror movies, this would have been Giri and his friends, but this was actually a really nice Russian family that gave me a ride to town. The listing disappears from the website in a few days after I left, and I haven't heard from Giri since. I've yet to make sense of this experience. I have traveled since and volunteered too. Some people, once they hear this story, laugh and say the guy was coming over with a few friends from the village to have a chat or a few beers. Some say he was bound to kidnap me and kill me. But I trust my gut feeling. Something was really not right. So Giri, let's never meet again. This happened to me back in college. I was maybe 20 or 21. I'm 27 now. It was a number of years ago. I had just moved into the trailer my father had bought me. It was a little trailer park out in the boonies where my cousin also lived, and the neighbors were all family friends. This occurred in southwest New Mexico. Anyway, I was living in this trailer with no electricity. The company hadn't been out yet, but I had water, a lantern, and I liked camping anyway. And as a poor college student, I had peanut butter, so that's what I had for dinner, along with bread. I went to bed and fell asleep fine, and woke up somewhere between 2 to 3 a.m. that night in the most pain I've ever been in. I'm talking 10 of 10, ready to call an ambulance. And there in the corner of the room was this tall, thin lady. It looked like something was wearing a lady's skin. She had thick, curly black hair which was wet, and was wearing some type of white slip. It just stood there in the corner of my room staring at me and smiling. It was not natural. The smile was way too wide while I'm writhing in pain on the mattress. I realize now I probably should have been scared witless, but I was honestly just irritated. And I remember saying, "Lady, I'm sick and don't have time to deal with you, get lost." then promptly ran past her into the bathroom and vomited for 10 minutes straight. When I came back to my room, I was fine, and the thing was gone. To this day, I'm not sure if it was actually in my room or if I hallucinated it. Thoughts? Has anyone else ever experienced anything similar? I live in Southwest Oregon. Several years back, I was offered a living situation on 80 acres of forested land as a caretaker. This land is absolutely stunning. It was logged back in the 50s, but everything has grown back since. And fortunately, a few of the old legacy trees were spared. I have made hiking trails out of some of the old deer trails when the poison oak isn't too bad. At times, it seems like paradise. But there has come a sense of uneasiness as well. To put into perspective, I live in an old farm cabin that was built in the 1930s as part of some kind of goat farming outfit. A friend of mine, who was almost like a father to me, has owned the property since the 60s. Said the young man who used to live there was real sketchy. When he first moved into the house, he built a new home elsewhere. All of the house's windows were painted black, and there were a few other odd things about it. The house sits in a box canyon, one way in, one way out, with a neighbor across the street at the end of a half-mile driveway into the canyon. The canyon walls are very steep and heavily forested, with Bureau of Land Management, public lands backing up on all sides of the property boundaries. There are real old, decrepit logging roads up on the Bureau of Land Management's land, but the two access points to these roads are heavily gated up and off limits. I've walked these old roads, as I have made some of my hiking trails up to them, and they're a good place to see wildlife. When I first moved onto the property, it seemed for months I would hear what sounded like metal banging behind my house up in the woods. The area it was coming from is heavily forested, and there are no houses there for dozens of miles. Whatever it was didn't sound like an echo or something of nature. It sounded real close. The friend of mine, the property owner, had said he had heard something similar through the years, and would then contact the Bureau of Land Management authorities to investigate. I'd also heard voices. I was home alone one day and heard people talking outside. My partner wasn't home, and so I called him to let him know what was up. I then went out with my bear mace in my jacket to see what was up. No one was out there. Just a cold day, though everything was oddly quiet. The neighbor would often tell us that she hears people's voices in the woods and yells out to them, but gets no replies, and she would ask if we were in the woods yelling that day, and we most certainly weren't. You also get the feeling of being watched. I know this is just a feeling, and one can brush it off as paranoia, but it's a feeling so strong, like something or someone is watching you from the tree line. My dog also goes off at all hours in a tangent, and when I investigate there is never anything there. A few more times I have come home and he is running around loose. Someone let him out of his play area that I set up for him while I'm away or in town. I also seem to find odd things on my hikes up to the Bureau of Land Management's land. I once found what seemed like an old trash pit from the 70s with old car parts, springs, and a mattress, and really old Coke cans, but there were also baby shoes and women's high heels. Something about it just made me cringe a little. This has all come to a head recently, when a friend of the owner's came to hunt on the property for deer. He's an elderly Native American man who comes every year during the autumn months. He came back this time and said while he was hunting, he went up to the Bureau of Land Management's land and stumbled across some bones. At first, he assumed from a distance that they were some long dead animal, until he got closer. He said they appeared to be the bones from a human hand. He came down and told us this and contacted the authorities. Apparently, the authorities also think it's a human hand and are doing further investigations. The voices, the feelings, the metallic banging sounds, the items in the trash pile, the bones, it all doesn't sit right with me. And every evening when I'm walking the property to put my chickens away for the night, I get a real ugly feeling in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it can all be explained rationally, but it doesn't make me feel any better living here. This happened when I was visiting some family members in Florida. We were having dinner one night when my uncle started telling us silly stories from his youth. He mentioned going to Casa Daga with his friends a couple of times, and immediately the rest of my family started chiming in with their respective Casa Daga stories. Not being a Florida native, I asked them what the hell Casa Daga was. My uncle told me that it was a small town not too far away from where they live. Okay, nothing too interesting about that. When he told me that it had a reputation for being the psychic capital of the world and that he and his friends would go there in high school because there was a rumor that it was haunted. Being a lover of all things creepy and paranormal, I immediately wanted to go and see what all the fuss was about. My uncle, being up for anything, agreed to take me. Mind you, we had just finished dinner, so this was around 9 p.m. My uncle, myself, and 2 other family members got into his truck and started driving there. After about an hour of driving, we turned onto a narrow gravel road. There were absolutely no lights on this road, and this happened during the summer of 2016, when that whole clown craze was going on. So, when we found ourselves in complete darkness in the middle of nowhere, all I could think of was some freak in a clown costume jumping out to scare us. We passed a lot of houses as we were driving, none of which had any lights on. Granted, it was almost 11 p.m. at this point, but I found it hard to believe that no one had any lights on in their houses. It definitely added to the creepy atmosphere. We finally made it to the hotel without any clown interference, to my delight. It was the only building that had any lights on, and for clarification, we weren't planning on staying at the hotel. My uncle just wanted to show me around and maybe talk to the locals a bit. We parked in the tiny parking lot in front of the entrance and got out of the car. I'm not sure what compelled us to do so, but we all left our respective car doors open. We walked up to the hotel and started looking inside. The lights were on, but there was also no one inside. We found this odd because we were potential customers, and I was expecting someone to come out and greet us. As we were all standing by the entrance, a silver car pulled up to the parking lot. It slowed down in front of us, and suddenly a man stuck out his head. "You're gonna regret this," he yelled, and drove off. Not a word was exchanged between me and my family members. Within a split second, we had booked it back to the car. My uncle started driving us back to the highway so that we could get home. At this point, I'm already freaked out. So when a black SUV with garbage bags taped over the windows starts tailing us, I start praying. It's the middle of the night. There was still no lights on this small road we're driving on, and now some madman was trying to run us off the road. Every time my uncle would speed up in order to avoid getting rear-ended, the guy in the black SUV would speed up too. We were driving at such an incredible speed that it only took us a few minutes to get to the road that connected us to the highway. The SUV was still tailgating us at this point. Halfway down the road, I noticed a familiar car parked on the side of the road by a ditch. It was the silver car from before. The driver was pulling something out the trunk as we were approaching him. Because of the speed at which we were driving, I couldn't see what he was getting out clearly, although I didn't see what was in his trunk. I didn't have a good feeling about it. When we finally got to the end of the road, my uncle was so desperate to get out of there that he ran a red and followed onto the highway. The black SUV didn't follow us on there, and we never really talked about what happened that night, and I basically had forgotten about that trip until today. This happened to a friend of mine while he was deployed to the Middle East. He's a Marine. The country he was deployed to have a tradition of camping in the desert each winter. He said it would be best to avoid mentioning the name because this happened in December and he prefers to keep it confidential. His unit were invited for a sleepover at the camp by one of the companies they do business with there. They went ahead and had dinner, shared some fun stories around the bonfire, etc. Now it was time to sleep. Apparently the area they were in was rocky and quite pointy, and the only thing between them and the ground was a very thin carpet and their sleep bags. My friend and another guy couldn't sleep, and they didn't want the locals to think that the big bad Marines are a bunch of wusses who can't sleep on the ground, so they didn't complain and just decided to go to the nearest hotel and get back in the morning. The nearest hotel was 45 minutes away, so my friend said he would lie down in the back seat while the other guy drove. Now, while in the car, my friend opens his eyes to see someone was sitting next to the driver. At first, he thought he picked up a hitchhiker because the one in the passenger seat was wearing local clothing and thought, "What the hell is this idiot thinking picking up strangers at this hour?" and just closed his eyes. After about 10 minutes, he was slammed into the front seat as the car suddenly brakes and the driver flees the car as soon as humanly possible. He gets out to see what happened and sees the other guy freaked out of his mind. Apparently, this someone suddenly appears out of nowhere in the passenger seat while he was driving, was too scared to turn around, but clearly could see them out the corner of his eye, so he just froze and kept driving until he mustered enough courage to slightly turn and get a better look. That's when the entity groaned, which made him freak out and flee. By the time they went to check on the passenger side, there was no one there, and they were certain the door had not been opened. I don't know if the following is related, but they did some asking, and apparently near the area they were camping were some old prisons that were carved into the mountain and used by the British to lock political prisoners, and just left them there until they starved to death. I'm very interested to learn what that was, and if anyone has had some similar stories. Growing up, I was always at my grandma's house. My childhood featured a parent with substance abuse issues, and going to my gram's house was the best. I had friends there, and she lived in a really nice suburb with tons of other kids my age. I made really good friends with a neighbor who had woods in his backyard, Mike. We'd often take little lunches packed by my grandma and go into the woods to eat them and admire creeks, birds, and collect pebbles and stuff, kid stuff. This was harmless, and you could usually always see the backs of houses when you went into the woods. I remember one day, we made a pack. Mine was in a grocery bag and planned to venture out further than before. You know how you have limitless energy when you're little, and low back pain hasn't set in from sitting at a desk for most of your adult life. You literally could walk for hours and probably many miles and not even notice, and eat a terribly made PB&J, swig down a can of Coke and be completely rejuvenated. Yeah, that was us. So we walked further than ever. We slid down a hill, and I remember being really scared of this, and hilariously, I'm still majorly scared to fall when hiking. I got a little scuffed up, nothing major, and Mike was slightly older than me, so I wanted to seem tough and just walk it off. We walked deep into the woods, and I remember being just slightly creeped out, but not enough to protest. I wanted to explore too. This is Western Pennsylvania, and I should add, we weren't in the rural areas of my state, but some of the suburbs do intersect with trails and nature preserves that can go on for acres and acres. As we're walking, we come upon a tent in the middle of nowhere. Not a marked camping area, just in the middle of nothing. I remember being terrified. My grandma gave me a lot of freedom because I was a pretty responsible kid, not to mention this was the 90s. Aside from needing to be home by streetlights, every night, stranger danger was something she drilled into my head. This set off the internal stranger danger alarm loudly, but at this point I was too afraid to leave Mike's side. So we approached the tent, even though everything inside of me is singing to get the hell out of there. Mike goes up to it. I tentatively follow him. At first I thought someone was just camping, but it looked more permanent than that. There's a fire pit that's still smoking. It appeared to have been doused, and there were bones everywhere, mostly skulls, tiny ones which to my untrained eye looked like animal bones. There were also little pelts of animals covered in what looked like paint and symbols. My adrenaline kicked me right in the arse and I ran. Mike ran too. We ran so far and so fast that we fell down the side of a hill and ended up emerging from the woods on the other side of a shooting range. The men firing were screaming at us to leave, which is understandable, and I also was so scared of the tent that I didn't process the real danger that we were in on a shooting range. We definitely could have died very tragically there. So looking back on this memory, I'm wondering, was this something nefarious? Or could it have been some harmless nomad living in the woods? If they were living there, maybe the bones were from the small game they had to live and eat from, but the pelts with symbols are throwing me. I don't know. This is a weird memory that I can still see clearly to date. What do you all think? This happened over a year ago. I'm a 53-year-old female, and am from the US, but now live in the UK. I thought this kind of thing only happened in Florida, where my family still lives, and I've had my fair share of creepy encounters there. But I like to think I'm a tough old bird who doesn't mind helping out a fellow human being. I was driving home with my dogs from my partner's house, as we were still dating at the time, and I had to work the next day and needed my work stuff. He lived an hour away, so it was a long drive home through the rustic English countryside. It was late-ish, but was still light, as summer lingered about on those lovely long sunsets. As I'm driving, I get a call from my son who was living in the US. I just wanted to pull over and touch base with my son to let him know that I was driving and would catch up with him when I got home. I pulled over at the next convenient stop, which happened to be a drive on someone's farm. I wasn't aware of this until after getting out of my car later. I had vaguely noticed a big barn next to the farmhouse, kind of unkept, with no lights on. It's still light out, so nothing overtly odd, I suppose, about no lights on inside the house behind the guy. While I'm talking to my son, both my dogs start to grumble about something. I look up and see a very big, tall, mid-60s to 70s older man waving at me for help. He had the hood/bonnet of his truck propped open and was sitting on a stool next to it. Since I had a mobile phone, I thought that I would offer to call someone to help him. As soon as I stepped out my car, he shouted at me to roll up my window because of my dogs. My babies are about the size of a beagle, and my girl is fiercely protective. So I roll only about halfway up, enough so they can still poke their heads out, but not down far enough so it's an easy jump from the car. Some people are just scared of dogs, right? Even though most farms have working dogs, but okay. As I get to his truck, I offer the phone. He's old, maybe he doesn't have a cell phone, you know. He says no to the phone call, and says he just needs someone to help fill the radiator because his car is overheated. So me being no stranger to a little light auto maintenance, I look over to see the radiator cap already off. He offered me a full bottle of water to which to perform this top-up. Mind you, the truck was stone cold. As I got to the radiator, it was already full of water, pesky alarm bells going off in my head even louder now. At this point, I should have just told him to call the AA, a car recovery service, or alternatively the police. He said no thank you again and began to thank me profusely for helping with his truck. He stood up and asked for my address so that he could drop off some sausages, because you see, he was a butcher. Alarm bells are just screaming in my head now, all the while my dogs are not loudly barking, but you can hear them nervously woofing from my car in the background some 20 feet away. Luckily, he seemed disabled since he was wearing a knee brace and also had a walking stick. I only got close to him once to get the water bottle handoff. I stayed at arm's length and made my excuse to immediately walk back to my car. I've never gotten out of somewhere so fast in my life. After recounting this story to my daughter, she said it was a good thing that the dogs were with me, and that they probably saved me from getting into further trouble. I seriously thought I had just met Leatherface's granddad. Definitely felt like a setup. Who sits outside in the semi-dark like that in the middle of nowhere, waiting for some chance help you don't really need to wander by? Super scary creepy. This encounter happened about 3 weeks ago, right around the time lockdown was in its prime here in Australia. I'm a 23-year-old female living near Byron Bay, about a 20-minute drive away in the surrounding hinterlands. I was born and raised in the city though, so I like to think my judgment of character is a bit finer developed than country folk. For those not familiar, Byron is a major tourist attraction in northern New South Wales, really close to the Queensland border. It's a beachside town known for its laid-back lifestyle. Because of this, we get a lot of passers-by, even a little bit further out because of the nice views and rich bushland. And it's not unusual to meet a few odd people here and there. There's also your dose of strange activity, i.e. backpacker Theo Hayes' disappearance not long ago. If you're interested in learning more about the case, The Lighthouse is a great podcast about it. Lots of people up here have their theories on it, ranging from cults to just straight up cold-blooded murder. In my suburb, it's still quite rural. On our street, there are about 5 houses total, covering a good couple of 100 acres. And at the end of the street, there's a path through the bush to a lovely waterfall. The journey from my property to the beginning of the track is about 5 minutes, and the path leads to 2 destinations. The first destination is about 5 minutes into the track at the top of the waterfall. It has a little wooden platform you can stand on to look out whenever the waterfall and stream lead into it. The second is about another 5 minutes down the track, which is the waterfall itself. Most people keep to the left of the waterfall and will sit under it in the cave, as the almost non-existent clearing to the right of it is quite inconvenient and tricky to get to if you aren't planning on getting really wet. This is important later. I used to go down there quite often to write in my journal and to clear my head, and my favorite place is just to the top of the waterfall. I'd climb through the fence next to the wooden platform and sit next to the stream on the rocky face that covers either side of the stream. The view was nicest there, and I also liked to sit facing the wooden platform so I could keep better tabs on my environment. This particular day, I went down and coming up to the track, I noticed a camper van parked with lots of tools and rope attached to the roof. I couldn't see anyone in there, but just had a bit of an inkling there was. So I gave the car a pretty wide berth, social distancing, but also my ever-present paranoia thanks to this and other true crime subs. As I passed, I noticed the side door was open, which quickly slid shut. Straight up, I thought it was pretty weird. It's illegal to set up camp there, and also, we were in a period of essential travel only, so I wasn't really expecting to see anyone down there, except for a neighbor going for a stroll. However, I passed it off as a triade, wanting to get out of the house into nature for a bit after work or something, and kept going on. I went to my usual writing place, but as we'd had a bout of pretty heavy rain in the few days prior, the stream was full, and I wasn't up to crossing it. So I sat on the same side as the wooden platform about 10 to 15 meters away. I wasn't there for long, maybe 5 minutes of writing with my headphones in when I heard something. It sounded like a bird over my music, so I went back to what I was doing. But then a few seconds later, I saw someone out the corner of my eye coming onto the platform. I ignored them and tried to go back to what I was doing, partly because I was in a pretty foul mood and wanted to be left alone, but also because it's not really common for anyone to talk to each other out in the bush, apart from the occasional, "How you doing?" passing someone on the back track. So I thought maybe they were on the phone. But no. He yelled out to me again, which I ignored, and then again I got the feeling he wasn't gonna let up. So I feigned surprise along the lines of, "Oh, sorry, I didn't see you and couldn't hear you over my music." He was in his late 30s to early 40s, a pretty ordinary looking dude. The rest of the conversation is hard to recall verbatim, but essentially it went like this. "Are you gonna jump off the waterfall?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I don't know how deep the water is." "Good answer." It seemed pretty harmless, and I assumed he was just visiting the falls for the first time, so I tried to cut off the conversation by going back to my writing. He didn't let up, however, and this is where it started to get a bit weird. I was already feeling quite unsettled by his presence, as he wasn't very focused on the surroundings, and more on me, which is pretty strange considering the entire world is in a state of encouraging no communication. "What, are you one of those nature people who likes to come out here by yourself?" "No." "What are you doing out here then?" "I'm just trying to clear my head and write. It's nice out here." "Am I bothering you?" "Yeah, but whatever." Honorable mention to my ADHD for making me always susceptible to saying the wrong thing and pretty much incapable of lying. There was a bit of a lull here, both of us just kind of sizing each other up. Me just really wanting him to get lost, but also not being too worried if he did try anything, as I had a large stick with me, and it was still pretty warm out, so I always carry it because of snakes. "How did you get here?" "Oh, I just climbed down off the path and through the fence." "No, I mean, how did you get here to this place?" I walked." "Pretty long walk to be out here by yourself." "Not really. I live just up the road." Something about this response changed something in his behavior. But, as we were pretty far apart, it was a bit hard to figure out what. Regardless, I wasn't vibing the situation at all, and was also kicking myself for making it glaringly obvious to some random dude I was out here alone, and for not having told my family where I was going. Guess I'll leave you to your writing." This calmed me a lot, and once again, just passed him off as a passerby. The view's a lot nicer under the waterfall if you follow the path. "Oh, I don't know if I could go alone. There could be some people down there waiting to mug me. You'd have to come with me." Like what? Who says this? Especially to someone you've just met in the middle of nowhere. No, probably just someone having a picnic or a swim. He stood there for a bit longer than I would have liked, staring at me, and then finally left me alone with an, "Alright, see you later," as he headed back up the path towards the parking lot, and I assumed he was going home. I still felt a bit uneasy, so I turned off my music completely and tried to go back to my writing. Some time passed, but I was struggling to concentrate, which isn't unusual. But it wasn't my usual restlessness. I just felt so uncomfortable, almost exposed, so I took a break to just enjoy the scenery and look down at the bottom of the waterfall. And this guy is standing to the right of it, really inconvenient to get to, and also was the only place from down there where you could see me. That's exactly what he was doing, just standing there staring at me. I thought I was just wigging out, but nope, I could literally feel his eyes on me. I noped out of there. Even if he was just a creepy dude with innocent enough intentions, I wasn't going to wait around and find out. I'd have a 5-minute head start if he did try to follow me. So I ran back home, and what was left of my journal entry for the day was essentially just about this weird guy. I waited to hear his car go by as well, but it didn't. Only one road, so I would have heard him leaving, which I thought was strange. So I assumed he must have set up camp there or whatever, or just left later in the night. Either way, I was sufficiently creeped out, and it ruined that spot for me. I haven't been back since. I had just turned 21 and frequented the bars regularly. In hindsight, I probably spent too much time drinking with my friends. I didn't have a car or cell phone, and I lived on the outskirts of town. It was a 45-minute walk downtown. The town I live in is generally a very safe place. It's a wealthy, well-to-do, white-bread community, so walking home alone at night after drinking was nothing that bothered me, other than the actual walking. It was a Tuesday night, and that meant pints were cheap, so I wouldn't say that I was completely wasted, but I certainly was more than tipsy. Instead of walking home along the sidewalk where I feared I'd be picked up by the police for being drunk in public, I decided to take the bike path that ran along the train tracks. This meant the walk would take longer, but was much safer and less likely to run into sort of trouble, or so I thought. The bike path was not very well lit, and knowing what I know now, I should have been a lot more nervous about walking alone in the complete darkness at 2 in the morning. Like I said, I had just turned 21 and was certainly an arrogant young male who was thinking about women and not minding my surroundings. I had taken this path many nights, and coming across anyone else was rare. If I did perchance come across somebody this late at night, most of the time it was just another drunk college student who had the same thoughts as me. Either that, or they were homeless. But if so, I'd say they were all harmless. So this night as I'm walking, I noticed further down the path that somebody was walking towards me. He wore a large hiking backpack and had his hoodie pulled over his head. It was so dark I couldn't see their face. I could really only just barely make out their outline. This person's gait unquestionably revealed him to be a male, who I figured was probably just a transient. It was odd to see somebody walking towards downtown at 2 in the morning. When I got really close to him, and we were about to cross the path, this person just stopped dead in his tracks, and I could tell he was staring at me because his head just followed me as I walked by. It creeped me out a bit, and I certainly felt like it was a bit odd. As I continued to walk, I shrugged at the situation. I didn't feel right. Something in my gut made me feel wrong. I stopped and turned around to see this person still staring at me. "What?" I asked him, as I stopped walking and remained to stare back to him. That's when he hissed at me like a snake. A long, vicious-sounding hiss that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I had hoped he was just being weird, or perhaps was on meth or something. I nervously laughed for a bit, and said something like, okay, and continued to walk on. I made it a few more steps and turned to look back. He somehow managed to get closer to me without making a sound, and he stood completely still. I figured perhaps I was just drunk and imagining things, and turned back around and walked, taking a few more steps. I turned around once more. Now I knew he was closer. I couldn't believe it. I could hear him approaching me. What unsettled me even more was how every time I turned around he managed to stop and stand completely still. Are you following me, buddy?" Once again he let out this creepy hiss and just stared at me. Now I was freaked out and had this strange sensation that I was some sort of prey. "Hey, piss off, man," I now yelled. In hindsight, this was a bad idea, because I already felt like I was some sort of target, and the last thing I should have been wanting to do is provoke this sick and twisted individual. I started backing away at this point, not taking my eyes off him. He just stood there hissing. The hisses were getting longer, louder, and more malice was apparent in him. As he started to hiss louder and louder, he began to engage in some sort of pursuit. At first, there were basic steps, and I backed away further. As he started to hiss louder and louder, he began to engage in some sort of pursuit. At first, they were basic steps, but the further I backed away, the more he sped up, taking bigger steps towards me. I said, "Forget this," to myself. "I'm getting out of here." I noped out of there and began into a fully fledged run, and he started running after me. I could hear his heavy boots gaining on me, hissing like a cat, growling like a dog. I feel his spit hitting me in the back of the neck. "Get away from me," I yelled, and I might have peed myself a little, I was so afraid. All I could think to do was to run as fast as I could and get inside of my house as quickly as possible. I've always been a very fast runner, but this guy was much taller than me and his legs were really long, so he was really cutting down the distance between him and me. I managed to get a good 5 between us though, checking back behind me as his arms reached out in an attempt to grab me. I finally made it out of the bike path and onto the crossing sidewalk of the street that was lit up by street lamps and a few passing cars. I was so relieved to finally make it back to civilization. There was a gas station over by my house, and I thought I'd run to the safety of its inside, only to see that the lights had been shut off and the doors were closed. It was closed. I had to make it to my house. As I got closer to my house, I could see my roommate's lights were on through the window. "Chris!" I shouted. "Chris, open the door!" I'm impressed I yelled loud enough that he actually heard me, and saw the front door to my house open up and my roommate standing at the doorway looking confused. I ran up the steps and almost jumped inside, slamming the door behind me. "Dude, what are you running from?" he asked. You don't see the guy chasing me?" "No." I ran to the window and looked out, but he was gone. I've no idea what happened to him, but I'm sure that it had really happened. Whoever the guy was who hissed at me was really shaking me up, and I never walked down that bike path after dark again. This story was relayed to me a while ago by a close friend of the family called Cliff. It takes place in the 1990s at Eels Lake, Ontario, Canada. So Cliff was out one night, making the rounds on his ATV, drinking at the local hunting camp. Sometime in the early morning, between 1 and 5 a.m., he decides to head home. When he pulled into his camp, he noticed that someone was standing out by his small woodshed, bordering a tree line. When he dismounted his ATV, this person approached him and asked to go on a nighttime walk through the woods and up to a clearing we called the mountain. He instantly recognized the voice as his wife's and agreed. At first he had to run inside and use the toilet. His wife protested, saying that he could just go in the bush along the walk and that if he went inside, he'd just rile up the dogs. Still he refused, told her to just hang on for 1 minute and ran inside to banish an eldritch horror into his septic tank. After finishing his business, he noticed that his dogs had been absent this whole time. Checking to see if they were okay, he found them both cowering under the main table of the camp. Even when he called, they wouldn't budge. They just lay under the table. Not thinking much of the situation, he headed into the bunk room to grab an extra flashlight for his wife. He recounted how glad he was that he just pooped, as when he entered the bunk room he was struck stiff as his wife was lying asleep in her bunk. After a moment of fear, he went to grab a rifle, loaded it, lit a fire, and sat inside until the sun came up. In the morning, he did a quick look around camp and didn't notice anything out of place. Nothing was stolen nor broken. He puts emphasis on just how real the experience was. Whatever spoke to him sounded exactly like his wife. and even spoke like she would. It was very insistent on going into the woods that instant, but never sounded annoyed or frustrated at his rejection. He didn't get a great look at the person, but he said it was identical to her, recognizable even in the dark. And that's the story. I was just speaking to him recently and we talked about it. He's pretty sure it wasn't her. My family has been in the area for many years, and I've heard lots of strange stories about the area, but never really encountered anything myself. Was it her doppelganger? Or perhaps something more sinister, trying to lure him out, pretending to be his wife? I was solo pitching for a long weekend in the Pacific Northwest, and one day was in the rare part of the trail that is closer to civilization, so there was a higher chance of other hikers and campers being around. I saw 1 or 2 people, but was mostly from afar, and as it was nightfall soon and getting cold, and I was getting deeper into the woods, I knew the odds of seeing someone else were highly unlikely. I was hiking around a small pond, and was going to set up camp nearby when I heard some shuffling noise behind a small rock/boulder. It was a repetitive noise and got louder and then quieter, but never stopped at all, and basically, if you're a regular hiker, you know a noise that does not fit the woods when you hear it. I took out my 2 knives that I carry when hiking and slowly walked around the boulder, honestly not knowing what I'd see. What I did not expect to see, and was very shocked to see, was a very attractive couple in their 20s going right at it aggressively on a blanket. Obviously they were as shocked as I was to come upon someone else, and they freaked out and yelled, as did I, and as they covered their bodies into their clothes in a panic, I awkwardly apologized, picked up my gear and sort of just jogged off into the woods, passing their tent that they had pitched along the way. Also in another part of the country, I thought I saw a bear once, and it turned out to be a giant pile of mud. I wonder if that couple is still together, and if they tell the story when they get drunk at parties like I do. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories. I thought I'd throw in that bonus one at the end as a little, just to liven the mood a bit. Little funny story. If you enjoyed tonight's video, please do not forget to share your love down below. It really is appreciated. I want to apologize again for not uploading yesterday. I'll give you a bit of context. Pandora is super obsessed with horses. I mean, this is her thing. So the day before, she was really into this toy horse, and she could hardly nap because she just wanted to play with this horse all day. And then she woke up in the middle of the night because this dog was crying. Now, I don't know if you heard properly or if you heard it at all, because while I was recording this video, which had to be recorded in 2 parts, because the dog just kept on barking. And, well, not so much barking, but crying. It's just crying next door or a few houses over. I'm not sure where the sound is coming from, but it's really concerning me. And yesterday it did make a peep all night, so I thought it was alright, but this morning it's just properly crying, and it's starting to concern me. Anyway, so yeah, the other night Pandora woke up at 2 AM because this dog kept crying, and it took about an hour to get it back to sleep, and consequently, we didn't have a very good night's sleep. And yesterday I went to bed so early, I was absolutely shattered. So yeah, I'm hoping today's video is launched on time. Thank you everyone for sticking around. It's really awesome. You guys are the best. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to my wonderful members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. If you'd like to support the channel with a small amount of money every month, get your name on screen, and a number of additional small benefits, I mean, that'd be pretty cool. Up to you though, guys. It always does really help me out. I think I'm going to leave it here. Again, I'm so grateful for you guys. Thank you all for sticking around. Remember that I'll be back tomorrow with a new video, so don't forget, hit the bell and subscribe if you're not already. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.